here it comes, the long-awaited, much-anticipated battery full of lunacy. So this idea has to do with hypernovelty and movement, or exercise. And it's the interaction between our very novel, modern environment and our ancient, evolved biological encasements. In other words, our bodies. So as biological organisms, obviously we have bodies that evolved under a certain set of selective pressures that were fairly consistent and reliable for a relatively long time, relative to the very short time we've been living in hypernovel, modern environments. So with that consistent, reliable set of selective pressures, our bodies evolved. So our bodies, the wisdom of our bodies, let's say, allot a certain amount of energy to physically moving in space. In an ancestral environment, there would have been physical demands placed on the human organism, and those physical demands must have been met with energy. This energy we'll call the battery full of lunacy. Every day we wake up with a replenished battery full of lunacy, and this lunacy is what we draw on to meet the demands of life, the physical demands of life. So there is, by the wisdom of the evolved body, a certain amount of energy allotted to physically navigating space day in, day out. Okay. That evolved under ancestral circumstances, and now we're in hypernovel modernity. So what does that mean? Obviously, the physical demands placed on our bodies nowadays are much fewer and less intense than they were in the past. So we have the luxury of being able to sit indoors and fulfill all of our most basic biological functions by not really expending that much energy. But this is unusual, given the consistent, reliable amount of time that our bodies evolved their ways. This hypernovel modern environment is unusual. Genetic evolution hasn't had time to adapt to the very ephemeral modern environment, and rightly so, because this is unusual in that we have an awful lot of exosomatic energy available to us, which was unheard of in the past. That were we to genetically adapt to this exosomatic energy abundance, as soon as that outside of the body energy abundance was no longer a thing, then we would perish. So our modern times are ephemeral in the sense that the energy abundance we experience now, thanks to fossil fuels, is unprecedented, and there will come a time when we no longer have access to such an abundant supply of highly concentrated energy sources. And so were we to genetically adapt to their availability and accessibility, as soon as they become limited and inaccessible, we perish. So the body correctly isn't evolving to this ephemeral selective pressure. But culturally, we are adapting ourselves to this, and we've become lazy slobs for the most part, because we can, because there's no necessity to physically navigate space anymore. We don't have to expose ourselves to these physically demanding pressures. So then the question is, we're faced with one of two pathways and we can choose which one to go down, as individuals and as a collective. The one path is accepting the lazy slob route and saying, I'm not going to expend energy because there's an exosomatic energy abundance out there, so I'm just going to take advantage of that and my body and mind will adapt accordingly. Or we can go down the more active participatory route of saying, I understand there's an exosomatic energy abundance, but the person I become were I to adapt myself to that in the default way is not the person I want to become. I want to be somebody who remains physically strong and mentally competent despite there being an exosomatic energy abundance. Hopefully that makes sense. So then the question is, how do we, in this hyper-novel modern environment, become that physically strong, mentally competent human being? And the answer I've come up with so far is by exposing ourselves to the correct type of stressors. So here we introduce two concepts. One, antifragility. Two, hormetic stressors. Antifragility is simply the opposite of fragility. Okay, so what's the opposite of fragility? In the face of certain stressors, you grow stronger. That is what being anti-fragile is. Something that's anti-fragile is something that, when it is stressed, perturbed, or in random circumstances, it grows stronger as a result, as opposed to breaking. Hormetic stressors are a certain type of stressors that, in sufficiently low amounts, induce a positive or beneficial response. That's it. So an example of a hormetic stressor is a cold shower. So a cold shower, when your body is exposed to a cold shower, it induces a response inside that is actually beneficial after you get out of the cold shower. But were you staying in the cold shower for too long a time, then it begins to negatively affect you because you lose heat and you get hypothermia and you die. So that is how I think, in this hyper-novel modern environment of exosomatic energy abundance, we can become strong, mentally competent human beings. But it requires that we actively engage the world and understand it as such, as opposed to just defaulting to the lazy slob route, which is what most people will default to, because we're evolved organisms who evolved in an ancestral environment where there was nowhere near as much exosomatic energy abundance available to us. So then there was an awful lot demanded of us physically. Life imposed its physical demands on us. As soon as those physical demands were met by exosomatic energy, our bodies, because they're evolved organisms, just say to themselves, okay, I don't need to allocate resources there anymore, so I won't. And then we become that lazy slob. Okay, so I think we're getting somewhere with this. So we as humans in our modern environment have the luxury. I say luxury because luxury implies that it's sort of positive and it has sort of positive connotations. But the luxury to do very little in terms of our physically expending energy in the world. Okay, but what this luxury brings about is the sort of the lazy slob route becomes the default mode. Unless you actively choose not to go down the default mode lazy slob route, you will go down that default mode route. So in not choosing, you are choosing, because the default mode is what you default to by not actively choosing a separate path or an alternative path. And this luxury is only the result of a massive amount of exosomatic energy being available to us in our modern times. But that energy availability is unprecedented and it's ephemeral. It's ephemeral in at least two ways. One, the fossil fuels that we rely on to run society are finite in their supply in the earth. But the second way that they're ephemeral is because of sort of political games. The fossil fuels will be limited. Access will be limited by those who have the most power over accessibility and distribution of fossil fuel energy. So that's where we're at. How does the individual then actively participate in their becoming a human that is admirable, respectable, honourable in this world where the default is a lazy slob route, where you become a human that's ineffective, incompetent, and incapable of dealing with the rigours of life outside of modern energy abundant circumstances. That's where antifragility and hormetic stressors come in. You want to expose yourself to the correct type of stressors. This actually requires that you think about what is the best way to become the type of person I want to become and to avoid becoming that lazy slob. There are many activities you can pursue or engage in. Weightlifting is one, and this is the classic example of antifragility, where you stress yourself by lifting weights, and over time you progressively increase the amount of weight you stress yourself with, and that causes the growth of muscle. So in response to that hormetic stressor that is weightlifting, the muscles grow and you become more capable of lifting even heavier weights across time. That's antifragility and hormetic stress. So to finish this off, let's go through what happens when you fail to discharge your battery full of lunacy. Okay, so in our hypernovel modern environment, the battery full of lunacy, when you elect to go down the default lazy slob route, recalibrates and it reaches its lower limit minimum. That lower limit minimum evolved during the ancestral times, where humans whose battery full of lunacy went below that didn't get through, didn't pass on their genes, say, for simplicity's sake. So there's a lower limit minimum that's adapted to an ancestral circumstance that we, in the luxury of hypernovel modernity with exosomatic energy abundance, most people will be operating at that level of the lower limit for the battery full of lunacy. But even then, even when the battery is at its lowest, modern humans fail to adequately discharge enough of the lunacy that is stored within, and this results in very many maladies and negative impacts for the individual, because the energy that's stored there, the lunacy that's stored at its minimum, but nonetheless there is some there, needs to find an outlet, so it discharges itself chaotically and randomly as opposed to in a directed, channeled fashion. That's why you need to choose the correct hormetic stressors to induce the antifragile response, because otherwise, in not choosing, you're choosing the chaotic, widely distributed, randomly distributed discharging of the battery of lunacy inwardly. So it causes you to just think about the world in fucked up ways that is incorrect, but you'd convince yourself is correct because it's your battery full of lunacy is imploding on you. So I think we're more or less there for this battery full of lunacy. We have a certain amount of energy allocated to physically navigating this world. We also have a choice. In making no choice, we default to the lazy slob route. But in making the active participatory choice, we can become humans that we admire. we can choose to either outwardly expend this lunacy, this store of lunacy that we all wake up with, replenished, blessed every day with this store of lunacy. We can choose to outwardly expend it, or it will, if we choose not to choose, it will by default inwardly implode on us and wreak havoc on both our bodies and our minds. Hopefully that makes sense. That was much more difficult to articulate than I thought it would be. But there you have it.